Bradley Manning's trial is once again postponed. A U.S. military judge says more time is needed to determine whether the U.S. soldier's treatment while in custody was too harsh. We examine Manning's case and how the U.S. treats its whistleblowers. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. He's the man accused of the largest ever government document leak in U.S. history. But it took more than 900 days after his arrest for the world to hear from Bradley Manning. On Thursday, during a pre-trial proceeding, he described the harsh conditions and the psychological trauma he endured while in military custody. During his time in a military prison in Quantico, Virginia, he said he was constantly monitored in his 6-by-8-foot cell, forced to stand or sit on the bunk with his feet on the ground and without any support for his back for most of the day. Now, the military judge has delayed the start of his trial in order to hear more evidence on whether his treatment was unlawful. The defense is arguing that because of the abuse he suffered, the charges against him should be dismissed. Manning is the most high-profile of the many prosecutions brought against whistleblowers during Barack Obama's presidency. His administration has prosecuted more whistleblowers than all other administrations combined, a fact that Obama campaigned on during his bid for re-election. However, last week the administration quietly signed new whistleblower protections into law. President Obama's supporters say that shows he is taking a sensible approach towards ensuring those who do witness wrongdoing are heard. So, how are whistleblowers treated in the United States? To discuss this, we're joined by Jesslyn Raddock. She's the National Security and Human Rights Director at the Government Accountability Project. She herself is a whistleblower. We also have Chase Madder, author of the book The Passion of Bradley Manning, and Larry Korb, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense and Senior Fellow now at the Center for American Progress. So let's begin with the Bradley Manning case. Jesslyn, you've been at some of these proceedings. How did he seem? We in the absence of actually hearing from him, we've heard lots of characterizations of him as confused and troubled and suicidal. Is that how he seemed?
That is not how he appeared at all. He presented as solid, thoughtful, well-spoken, and highly intelligent, based on the narrative that we've been fed for the past couple of years, that he's this fragile individual, borderline personality. That's not what I saw at all. I was completely impressed by his demeanor. Now,
it's notable that, there is no official transcript, no recording devices are allowed into the proceedings, which is interesting in a trial which centers around issues of transparency, exactly. I suppose. So we have a few accounts that were tweeted and written after the event. I think we picked one here from firedog.lake.com, Kevin Gostala. But given you were there as well, perhaps you can add to these snippets that we have here, and perhaps you can add a bit to what we're reading out here. Here's one excerpt where Bradley Manning described how his sleep patterns were reversed while in solitary confinement in a cage in Kuwait. I should actually underline that, in a cage in Kuwait. Quote, "Nights were my days, days were my nights, it all blended." Manning said he started to deteriorate in terms of awareness of my surroundings and what's going on. Those are his words. Everything was, quote, more insular, and I sort of lived inside my head. Justin, perhaps you can help us understand that. He was in a cage.
He was in an animal cage, basically, kind of similar to the cages you've probably seen photos of at Guantanamo Bay. But yes, he was in a cage.
And why was he treated like this? This is a specific policy, though, to keep him awake at night and have him sleeping during the day.
That's actually a common torture technique. I'm not sure if there's any rhyme or reason to why they were doing that other than to cause disorientation among pretrial detainees, but certainly reversing days and nights.
So specifically woken up at 11 or
yeah, he was
midnight.
Woken up, right, late at night, and then was up till 7 in the morning, I believe. And was very already disoriented and confused. He was dehydrated. The air conditioning broke one day, and he actually ended up passing out from dehydration. So the Kuwait confinement sounded like the roughest of his stints, though certainly Quantico didn't sound like any picnic.
Right. Well, here's one last account that we've highlighted from his Kuwait experience from, again, firedoglake.com. The guards would have him sit down in his cage, facing away, and then they would enter and tear apart everything in his cell. He did not know what they were looking for or if they were searching for anything. So these nooses were found, apparently, though, when guards did a shakedown and came into his cell. They tore his stuff up, and he thought, quote, "I'm going to die and I'm in a cage and I don't know what's going to happen, and that's how I saw it," end quote, an animal cage. Manning told the court he had contemplated taking his life, but it was, quote, futile. He had no means to do it. There wasn't anything to hang a noose on if he had made one. It, quote, felt pointless to try and commit suicide. This is significant because much of the account, or at least the prosecution's case for keeping him in these conditions is supposedly to prevent him from doing harm to himself. Is that correct? And so this noose has become quite central, I suppose, to the argument that he was at risk of committing suicide or doing some sort of harm to himself.
I don't think Bradley Manning denied at all that while he was in Kuwait, he felt suicidal and he felt anxious and depressed. However, he was put on anti-anxiety medication during Kuwait, and by the time he was at Quantico, he was only there for a couple of weeks before he was so stable and even that they took him off the medications. Certainly, they have used the fact that he did admittedly feel suicidal in Kuwait to maintain him in this strict solitary confinement for 9 months.
Was there any discussion as to whether it was his confinement that was leading to his sense of withdrawal or him?
Well, certainly the psychologists, all of them, and there were 4, all testified that he should not have been on suicide risk or prevention of injury status. And they even testified that that in itself was a stressor, and that was causing him, that would cause anyone to become anxious and depressed and uncommunicative.
Right. Well, let's move to Quantico then, the Marine Corps base in Virginia. He was placed in a 6-foot by 8-foot cell, slightly bigger than this table that we're sitting at, actually.
That's
in fact,
correct.
I suppose. There was no natural lighting directly coming into the cell. He had no reasonable way to access natural light. He could see a window down the hall from his cell if he took his head and put it on the cell door and looked through a crack in the grating. If he did that, he could see a reflection of the window, otherwise no natural light. The cell was lit with a fluorescent light. Outside of his cell was a fluorescent light that would blast full light, including during the night. And Jocelyn, in fact, actually, he was made to sleep facing that light. So even if he did try and sleep facing away from the light, he would be woken up and then moved so that he would be facing the light.
That's correct.
And then one more part that we've isolated. The Guardian's Ed Pilkington was at the hearing. This is a part of his extract of Manning's cell at Quantico. The cell contained a toilet that was in line of vision of the observation booth, and he was not allowed toilet paper when he needed it. He told the court he would stand to attention by the front bars of the cell and shout out to the observation guards, Lance Corporal Detainee Manning requests toilet paper. Jocelyn, again, this idea that he was effectively being humiliated.
Yes, well, at the best, he was being humiliated, and at worst, tortured. Obviously, there was, in addition to having to ask for toilet paper, he was made to stand at attention naked for days in a row, for many days in a row. And there was kind of this constant, very, very tough, unfair, things that used to be called enhanced interrogation techniques were used without second thought on Bradley Manning in terms of prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation. They took his glasses and he cannot see. He was essentially blinded, and forced nudity, and that's just a tip of the iceberg in terms of the way he was treated. Now, normally, if someone got treated this way in a criminal court, the case would get thrown out. That's part of the reason that we're not trying people on Guantanamo Bay in our civilian justice system. But because Bradley Manning is in this court-martial, the case is going forward. I mean, she could theoretically toss out the whole case. I hope she would, but I doubt she will.
It's not bad just to underline. I mean, he was in solitary confinement for all this time as well.
He was in solitary confinement 23 hours a day and was allowed 20 minutes each day of sunshine call to go outside. And even when they improved that later on and let him go out for a full hour, that's still not enough. I mean, it's amazing that you can come out of that and not be stark raving mad. But
Lawrence Korb, I mean, as we hear this testimony, can you understand why he's being treated like this? I mean,
well,
yeah.
I can explain it, but I can't defend it. And I think that's the key thing. You know, the United States is going to prevail in this struggle against these violent extremists by who we are and what we stand for. If we treat someone, remember, under our system, you're innocent till you're proven guilty. So to treat someone like this, and you know, they did this for his first year, then he went to Leavenworth, okay, you know, after that, and he was treated like a normal prisoner. But, you know, in Iraq and Kuwait and then in Guantanamo is inexcusable. And, you know, the government probably is overplaying its hand. Back when we had the release of the Pentagon Papers years ago, which people claim was sort of like what he did with WikiLeaks, that case was thrown out because the Justice Department broke into the psychiatrist's office of Daniel Ellsberg. And there's a very good reason why this is probably going to be thrown out, because in fact you have violated, you know, this person's right. And as a minimum, if he does get convicted of something, all of this time should be deducted from whatever sentence he might get.
But Chase, I mean, clearly the prosecution still thinks it has a case. I mean, what do you? I mean, clearly then, so the advice of psychiatric professionals was ignored throughout this time.
Flagrantly ignored.
I mean, it's difficult not to come to the conclusion that some sort of decision was made to break him in some ways. Then.
I think they were hoping that he would implicate Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and this was a means to crush him and to make him do so. And he didn't do it, which is, again, very much to his credit. One thing I have to point out about this treatment of Bradley Manning, these 11 months of pretrial solitary confinement was atrocious. It resembles the Soviet psychiatric prisons, psikushkas, that political dissidents were placed in and pumped up with drugs because they thought differently, and that was seen as a mental illness. But it's also not far from the mark of our normal federal prisons, where we have between 70 and 100,000 inmates doing long-term solitary confinement.
It's become sort of routine.
It has become routinized in the United States. So I say that not in any way to defend the treatment, but just to point out that we have a right to be appalled by it, but really not surprised by it in the United States. I was just reading about an elementary school in Washington State with the very pastoral name of Mint Leaf Elementary School, where they have a tiny solitary confinement chamber. Of course, it's just for a few hours at a time, but this has really seeped into our culture and become accepted as normal.
Well, we might come back to that as we discuss, in some ways, how the liberal media treats Manning and these sorts of complaints later on. As far as the current things stand, as far as his plea, there were reports, Jessalyn, then that he was prepared to plead to lesser charges of mishandling documents.
Right, that's been tabled for now, basically. I don't fully understand the court-martial proceeding, but the way that works is that will be decided upon later on. But right now, in terms of the conditions of confinement, that could ultimately get the case dismissed, but more likely get years shaved off the sentence. And although people are kept in solitary here in the U.S., a number of military officers testified that their own death row inmates had more freedom than Bradley Manning.
If this isn't thrown out then, what does the prosecution have to prove that in order to prosecute successfully Manning on either for aiding the enemy or under the Espionage Act?
Well, under the Espionage Act, normally you would have to show that somebody has the intent to harm the United States or to benefit a foreign nation. That is something that Judge Lind in Manning's case and that Judge Brinkema in John Kiriakou's case and Judge Bennett in Tom Drake's case all weighed and have been tinkering with. So right now, no one's entirely sure what exactly they need to show.
Actually, we have a bit more information about some of those figures that you mentioned who, I mean, it's very interesting. Barack Obama has attempted to prosecute 6 people under the Espionage Act of 1917. That's more than all other administrations combined. The act was used in the early 20th century to target labor leaders and political figures like Eugene Debs, Bill Haywood, and Emma Goldman. There is John Kiriakou, who's accused of giving reporters information about the CIA's torture programs, including waterboarding. There's former NSA official Thomas Drake, who was charged with mishandling classified material for telling the Baltimore Sun that the National Security Agency was allegedly wasting taxpayer money on inefficient intelligence gathering. State Department analyst Stephen Kim was accused of releasing secret information in 2009, including warnings from US officials that North Korea planned to respond to a new round of UN sanctions with another nuclear test. Former CIA agent Jeffrey Sterling is accused of disclosing information to a New York Times reporter on CIA efforts to sabotage Iran's nuclear program. And former FBI linguist Shemai Leibowitz is serving 20 months in prison for leaking conversations among Israeli diplomats in the US, which described an Israeli campaign to create a hostile environment for relations with Iran. Bradley Manning would, again, so it's not entirely clear then how this would relate to Bradley Manning, or is it simply, look, he leaked
It's the military side of this.
Right.
So it does relate. I mean, but all of these cases are keeping an eye on each other.
Right.
I represent Thomas Drake and John Kiriakou, two of the whistleblowers who've been charged criminally. So I think the judges are keeping an eye on what each other is doing in terms of interpreting this very vague, antiquated, notoriously bad Espionage Act, which was supposed to go after spies, not whistleblowers.
It is fascinating, Lawrence Korb, that President Obama is such a fan of the Espionage Act.
Well, I'm glad that he finally did sign the Whistleblower Protection Act, and I think you have to. It's hard to tell whether these cases were pending or they all come out, or he had his people do it. But I think the key thing is here, you've got to prove that it harms the interests of the United States. All the stuff I've read doesn't seem to be harm the interests.
And even officials in the Obama administration have called it overwrought. Any suggestion? Robert Gates, the former or the defense secretary, suggested there was nothing here.
And it's not just the Obama administration. It's all administrations are somewhat hypocritical, because when they release it for their own good, then it's okay. But if you were, and I had a situation when I worked in government where a brief I gave got leaked to the papers, and we had lie detector tests, and and all of that type of thing, and eventually nobody was convicted. So I think that to me is, I would like to see us the case and say, okay, you release this. This is the harm. If you can't prove that.
But Chase, it's probably not a bad moment then to remind us of how much information there was in the documents that Bradley Manning leaked about wrongdoing and war crimes.
Absolutely. I think if the collateral murder helicopter video had been released under, say, George W. Bush and Cheney, then there would be no problem on the part of the mainstream media and even many political leaders to greet Bradley Manning and WikiLeaks as whistleblowers, and also for the evidence of widespread torture under the nose of U.S. occupying forces that Bradley Manning is alleged to have released. This is all very important. Let me back up, though, and just give you a little bit of perspective on the whole secrecy landscape, because much of the response to WikiLeaks in the United States has been conditioned on this notion that this is a terrible threat and that we're on the verge of a precipice to a slippery slope to total transparency, where there will be, impossible to govern properly. In fact, what Bradley Manning is alleged to have released, the classified material, is not even 1% of what Washington classified last year. And for every day of the pretrial hearings of Bradley Manning, the federal government did classify another 250,000 documents.
So is President Obama, though, is he increasing the number of documents being classified there, or is this simply in line with...
He has increased it.
It has increased, and declassification did slow down last year, too. There is a backlog of some 300 million documents, according to Stephen Aftergood of the Federation of American Scientists. This is very much a bipartisan problem. It was a huge problem also under Bush and Cheney, and before that, too. But we have a huge problem with secrecy, and this has terrible national security costs and consequences. One of the things that got the U.S. into Iraq in 2003 was a lot of government secrecy, distortion, and lies. I don't think that's a controversial statement. But we pay a very heavy price in blood and money, other people's and ours, when we have such extreme secrecy about important information that the general public really needs to know before making important decisions.
And Lawrence Scott, we know that President Obama is expanding covert wars and increasing the war on terror in the meantime, as we know that he's classified. And this is rather terrifying. And yet his progressive champions, both in the media and elsewhere, don't seem too concerned about President Obama.
Well, they should be. I think when you take a look at all of those figures, you know, one of the paradoxes here is Democrats try and show they're tough on defense, so they sometimes overreact. But you know, the point you made, before we went to Iraq, there was an unclassified national intelligence estimate that glossed over all of the differences. The classified version could only be read by members. And I talked to the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He said, if you read that, you'll know there's no case for going to war. That should have been released to the American public before we decided to, you know, all the blood and treasure that we expended there. Yeah, my thing is too much is classified. I mean, it's way, way, way too much. We've got to cut down on that. And I would suggest
President Obama, I mean, again, you say, well, how much is he involved with and how much isn't he? But I mean, surely this is coming from the top.
Yeah, I think he's got to set the tone. I think he really, really does. And hopefully with this Whistleblower Protection Act, we'll move in that direction.
But is there any evidence that the new Whistleblower Protection Act would help Bradley Manning or anyone?
No. In fact, the new Whistleblower Protection Act, it does a lot of good things, but specifically excludes national security and intelligence whistleblowers.
At the request of the White House, though, isn't it?
At the request of the White House and Congress, killing those two people. They're not included in the presidential directive or the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act. And they are the category of people who are being prosecuted for blowing the whistle and exposing fraud, waste, abuse, and patent illegality.
I mean, on Bradley Manning's case there, I mean, couldn't he use the Nuremberg principles? That he has a requirement to expose wrongdoing and international war crimes, as per the U.S. Army Field Manual, actually, and so forth, or does that not?
I think that would be a very difficult stretch. I mean, I think such defenses only work if the political climate is conducive to them. And the political weather conditions are not in favor of Bradley Manning the way they were in favor of Dan Ellsberg 40 years ago. Bradley Manning's great misfortune was to release all these things, allegedly, while a Democrat is in the Oval Office. Ellsberg's great fortune was to have the Nixon government go after him like a bunch of clumsy thugs. I mean, not only did they break into a psychiatrist's office, they tried to bribe the judge by offering him the directorship of the FBI in the middle of the trial.
But that's what's so interesting. I mean, even as journalists routinely use WikiLeaks cables now in their reporting, they still don't. I mean, there hasn't been much coverage of the Bradley Manning case here. And certainly when Julian Assange was doing the rounds last week, it seemed like it was liberal journalists who were queuing up to try and do a tough interview on Assange and show that they weren't taking any nonsense. It's quite perplexing, actually.
It's a terrible betrayal of a source. Journalists and well-established newspapers and media businesses are supposed to protect their sources, not dump on them and then ignore them, which has happened to Bradley Manning.
And yet, at the same time, though, they appear, I don't know if you've noticed this, to be generally giving President Obama the benefit of the doubt with all this secrecy, that if these documents are secret, well, there must be a good reason for it. And actually, again, even liberal commentators suggest, well, Bradley Manning, in the end, you know, these were secret documents. I mean, they may not have been
I think
secret,
the media has been far more deferential in Manning's case. There's been hardly any coverage of his hearing, which arguably is one of the most important hearings of the decade. It's been a bunch of bloggers and small news outlets. Kevin Gostola's been incredible. Alexa O'Brien, incredible. But the New York Times sent a reporter. They've been cribbing off the AP. And I think the media has had this, this very cognitive dissonance going with respect to WikiLeaks, because they're like, well, WikiLeaks is bad. They don't vet the documents. They don't do
Well, they attempted to vet the documents.
careful research.
It was a
that we
Guardian
do.
reporter who kind of
Right.
leaked the password. For
But
that.
then they reprint the parts of the documents to suit their needs. Yet at the same time, oh, well, Assange is not a real journalist, and he is a media
And what about the
outlet.
people, I mean, there's huge evidence of war crimes and wrongdoing in the reports. Has anyone actually been prosecuted as a result of what we found out in WikiLeaks?
No.
I will say one good thing, the Voice of America has started to cover this, which again I think is good. That's a government outlet getting out to the world and saying a lot of the things that my colleagues have said here today. So, I mean, I think that is important. As far as I know, nobody in the administration has tried to, stop them from doing that.
All right, well, Lawrence Corp, thank you very much. Jessalyn Radek, thank you.
Thank you.
Chase Murder, thank you as well.
Thank you.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering.